The blackout that lit up my life, I was folding laundry when the lights died. It happened in a single, soft-silvered instant, a hiccup of electricity that turned the apartment into a grayscale photograph. The washer hummed once and went quiet. The refrigerator gave a little metallic groan, and then nothing but the murmur of the building's distant pipes filled the kitchen. For a breath, I thought it was only my unit, an old fuse, my curse of living on the 4th floor above a bakery. But then the stew of neighbor noises switched off in succession, the television silence, the abrupt parking garage motor stutter. Someone's phone alarm trapped mid-ringtone. The digital clock over the stove blinked and slumped into black. In that slice of sudden dark, all the small, confident rules of my evening rearranged themselves. I dropped the towel in my hands and felt the unexpected, delicious flush of being untethered. The apartment looked different without its electric scaffolding. The painting over my couch, a long-ignored print of a city at dusk, seemed real again, its colors deep and private. The room smelled like hot laundry and lemon detergent and the faint, comforting yeast of the bakery 2 floors below, a smell you can only notice when light and noise make room for it. My phone screen glowed in my palm like a distant lighthouse, because of course the battery is the last thing you check, then the last thing you rely on. I fished through junk drawers for a candle, and the whole apartment turned into a small archaeological dig, matches in a jar, a tea light, an old emergency flashlight whose battery I had never changed. I set the candle on the coffee table like a tiny altar and watched the flame spread light like a hand through the dark. There was a particular beauty to how the flame made the room 3-dimensional again, carving out the couch and the bookshelf and the small, crooked succulent in its ceramic pot. The city beyond the windows dropped its neon intensity to a dim wash. The alley lights seemed to blink as if confused, but in my window reflection the candle had a companion, another small flame in the neighbor's balcony a few yards away. I did not know her. I had seen her before across the courtyard, polite waves in passing, a package delivered by UPS with her name on it, a persistent trail of muddy boot prints, and a dog leash knotted on a hook. We were neighbors who noted each other's schedules and never shared ours. In my head, she was a collection of quick, friendly impressions. Tonight the power outage made her a silhouette with a flame. The knock at my door was urgent enough to send my heart stuttering, a polite battering that didn't respect my careful morning routines. Her voice at the door was not the thing I heard. Instead, I registered the packet of motion and breath, a pause, the rustle of a coat, the knock repeated with small insistence. She stood framed in the corridor glow, shoulders hunched against an invisible wind, hair darker knot at the nape of her neck, eyes bright from the suddenness of the night. Her face was not famed or stylized. It was the sort of face a person remembers because it has lived lines, because it moves easily into expression. She looked both panicked and determined, cheeks flushed, a smear of flour on one sleeve that made me laugh silently inside, even as I understood how precarious the world felt when power stops. Her hand held 2 flashlights, one in need of a new battery and the other that cast a straighter, steadier beam. She held them out as if offering a bridge. Immediately, the formalities between strangers dissolved. Constrained by the absence of screens and the smallness of light, introductions came folded into actions instead of names. I took a flashlight. She shrugged out of her jacket and draped it over a chair. We turned our faces to a single candle and the room rearranged again, 2 warmed semicircles of skin, a circle of light that had become our shared world. She moved with an unhurried confidence that suggested rural habits, fixing things, preparing for the unexpected, and when she set her bag on the floor, it released the scent of coffee and something woodsy, like cedar. There was an ease to her that felt like an answer to the city's clipped edges. Even in the small room, our hands passed in the space between us, a flashlight angled toward the fuse box, a quick exchange of batteries. There was laughter, not because anything was funny, but because the absurdity of grown people corralling candles and flashlights felt ridiculous and therefore light. We improvised. There was the practical choreography of powerless living, moving the candles to safe places, stacking books under a table to create a makeshift shelf for the tea kettle I could heat on a tiny camping stove, which she happened to have tucked in her bag as if she'd anticipated emergency. She set it up with the surety of someone who had practiced survival in small, civilized ways, foldable legs, measured pulls, the quiet hiss that becomes a domestic hymn when the world is otherwise quiet. The kettle steamed like a shy animal. We sat across from each other on the floor, backs against the sofa and the wall, sharing the same small circle of lamplight and passing biscuits between plates like a ritual. In the hush, the city seemed to lean in, holding its breath to see what the dark would make us do. Candlelight turned conversations honest in a way I had not expected. Without the digital buffer, without the endless scroll of other people's lives, we were left with our raw selves. She told me, not with words, but with that slow unfolding of detail that adds up to a person, a thumb calloused from guitar strings, a small tattoo curling behind one ear. The faint smudge of soil under a thumbnail that told me she belonged to some other kind of world than mine. She spoke of small disasters, an oven that quit 2 weeks ago, a car that refused to start, a dog that refused to stop howling. I told her about the screenplay that had stalled in a folder on my laptop because the story kept shedding the skin I offered it. We traded the kind of secrets that are not confessions, but the comfortable sharing of the things you would tell someone you barely know but suddenly trust, which book you read twice because it felt like a friend, how you take your coffee, who you called the night your mother left town. The candle washed her face in soft gold and made her eyes reflective like pools. In the darkness, the shape of her jaw became familiar, as if I had traced that line in a dream and only now recognized it awake. There were ordinary, ridiculous moments that became stitches in a fabric of becoming. We burned popcorn and laughed until tears blurred the candle flame. A bowl of cereal proved to be a fragile, mostly raw dinner when the stove refused to light, and so we ate a meal that was pedestrian and yet felt ceremonious, an accidental communion of two people who had been neighbors and were now comrades. When the flashlight slid off a book and landed on her hand, I noticed the small scar on the knuckle like a moon. My fingers leaned toward that scar the way a compass leans to a pole. My hand rested on hers and did not have an intention beyond warmth at first, but there was an electricity to the contact that was neither the city's nor the grid's. It was something domestic and private and enormous all at once. The night lengthened and the conversation deepened. Without the interruption of beeps or the steady white noise of appliances, the rhythms of honest exchange returned. She shared the story of the horse she cared for, a big chestnut mare that had a stubborn streak and a way of sleeping with one eye half open. She explained, in a tone that made me picture the mare's coat catching sunlight, how breeding records mattered to her, how survival on the farm was a negotiation with weather and markets and people with more money than ethics. I told her about the small betrayals of the industry I'd tried to get into, the editors I had impressed into polite indifference, the rejections that had taught me how to be quieter in company. She listened with the kind of attention that does not plan interruptions, and when she guided my hand toward the teacup, I felt something in the uncoil that I had not known was knotted. When the city's lights returned in jagged, complaining bursts, there was a peculiar grief, as if the world had been rewired to its old script of 10,000 obligations. The fridge clicked on like an electronic throat clearing. The blue glow of phone screens returned to the dark like cold moons. Yet, in that shift, something had changed irrevocably. The candle flame had smooth edges we had not had time to notice, my prejudices, her assumptions, the polite distance we'd each kept from one another in a building full of people moving the same way but never intersecting. The moment the breaker hummed back to life, I realized I was reluctant for the night to end, reluctant to let light conceal what we had uncovered. It mattered that we had discovered a version of ourselves that did not require labels or arguments or the electric hum of other people's curated lives. After the outage, the coffee was a reason to continue. It began as convenience. She had to return to her apartment for something she claimed she forgot and asked if I wanted to walk to the corner place with her. We walked in daylight that felt softer because of the night's absence, as if the blackout had retuned the city into a scale that allowed vulnerability. We sat across from each other at the cafe's chips table, hands sometimes touching like the punctuation of a sentence, and spoken sentences that did not need to be defended. She was taller than I expected when she stood, and close up the color of her eyes was not a single blue, but a sprawl of sea green and gray like tide pools. There was a slow bloom between us that was not cinematic fireworks, but the careful unfurling of petals. It felt like the construction of a habit. We began to appear for each other during small, prosaic hours, bringing soup when one of us had a cold, lending a blender, holding a thermos like a talisman in the rain. The affection grew in the small geometry of shared inconvenience. She came to my writing readings and sat in the third row like gravity, and I went to the veterinary clinic to sit with her while she sorted vaccines and bills. Each small act felt significant because it was not performative, it was the quiet exchange of time, and time is the currency of care. The first kiss happened soft and unplanned in the doorway of her apartment, with the afternoon light pooling at her feet and the smell of hay blown through open windows. It was the kind of kiss that felt inevitable because of all the small inevitabilities that had led to it. Our hands brushing on the way to the mailbox, the shared blanket on the couch during a thunderstorm that would send the city into an actual hum, the quiet confession over coffee that we both liked the same obscure author. Her lips were warmer than the candle flame had been, and when I pressed back there was an instant of falling in which everything that had been unnamed folded itself into a single, bright fact. We kissed a second time in the kitchen, leaning against the counter in a tangle of grocery bags and a half-open cookbook, and a third time on a balcony while the city moved below us disinterestedly. The kisses were not things that announced themselves loudly. They were stitches sewn into clothing we had been wearing for years, repairing as we went. The spark that endured the power outage was a lightning strike that did not necessarily determine the weather that followed, but it did change the geography. After that first night, the casual possibility of each other became an appointment we kept. We tested the edges of what we were: friends, partners in necessity, something that relied more on presence than on labels. There were tentative steps, an invitation to dinner that looked like a practical question of whether to pick up extra groceries, a walk at dusk that lasted for hours because the city's lamplight had the generosity to make the horizon softer. I began to crave the sound of her keys at the door, the way her laugh made itself bigger than the room. She became my small daily weather pattern. There were awkward moments, too, the sort of clumsy reveals that happen when two people negotiate a boundary for the first time. I confessed, in a rush of self-reproach, to the way I feared losing independence if I let myself depend on another person for warmth. I had learned independence as armor, but with her it started to feel heavy and unnecessary. She told me about the farm's precarious finances in the kind of blunt pragmatism that made my spine square. She talked about past relationships in vague, quick strokes no one who had stayed. She showed me blueprints of a stable she'd kept in a tube in the closet like a sacred relic. She dreamed aloud in a manner that made me both ache and plan. Those conversations were not melodramatic. They were the practical logistics of building a life with someone else, slowly and with humility. We kept returning to the night of the blackout as a talisman, repeating the story not as a boast, but as a way to remember how honest we had been before expectations could harden into judgments. I would watch her while she did something small, tending a plant on the windowsill, running a hand through her hair before she left the house, and feel a steady gratitude. Gratitude was a quiet emotion in me at first, a constant low note that underpinned the other storms in my life. It grew louder when I learned she had taken down a fence to make space for a full pen, when she had rescued a stray mare that no one else wanted, when she had turned down an offer that would sell the land to developers because she could not stomach losing that history. The first real test came in the form of an external pressure that had nothing to do with us, an investor who wanted to buy the property, promising tidy sums and grazing rights, and an eventual buyout plan that would leave the land hollow of the people who had built it. She received a letter on thick paper with a polite tone and a bottom line. The letter smelled like money. Her jaw tightened in ways she never allowed in front of me, and for the first time since the blackout, I saw fear lace her movements. In the evenings afterward, we sat on the porch with coffee and her old legal pads and argued, not heatedly, but like two engineers working through a bridge plan. There was the option of a fight in court, the option of partnerships, the more likely option of selling what she loved, because the math left her no room for stubbornness. She worried aloud in gestures and lists and uncomfortable silences. I offered what I could: time, an outside perspective, the willingness to write grant proposals and make phone calls. I felt clumsy and essential at once. I was an urban writer with contacts and a voice for proposals. The roles reversed intuitively. When she needed to argue with bankers or to stand in front of a zoning board, I was there not because I had to be, but because staying mattered more than my half-baked fear of becoming someone else's support. That test forced us into a new intimacy: legal documents, a lawyer's temper, spreadsheets stretched over a kitchen table like stretches of farmland. We learned the language of compromise, what to accept under pressure, what to hold as non-negotiable. There were nights when she would fall asleep in my lap with her breath even and my hand tracing the small scar on her knuckle. There were mornings when I would wake to the sound of her writing lists before the sun, plotting for a future I had never pictured for myself. She chose battle after battle because she thought of what the farm meant to her family's bloodline. I chose ways to help because I had learned how to assemble stories into convincing forms. We built a small, fierce team of two. Turning point, the first major twist. The twist arrived in the form of someone who knew her past better than I ever would, a person whose arrival shook the pattern we had carefully settled into. It was a woman from her childhood, someone who had helped shape decisions long before I existed, someone with a voice that could reframe the small, hard-won victories into habits. She arrived on a bright morning with a suitcase, an easy smile that felt like both sun and radar, and a history with my neighbor that was loud in all the ways history is when it returns. The reunion with this woman was measured at first, a polite exchange of courtesy and family stories. Then it was the comfortable intimacy of old bonds. It was not that she was unkind. I sensed instead a steady competence in her gestures, the way she seemed to know where to sit, which tea to pour, how to move pieces on the table to make the farm's problems seem, momentarily, solvable. But with that competence came the awareness that my neighbor carried baggage with her name, an expectation that she defer to this woman's expertise, an almost filial deference that she could not fully explain itself. The woman had resources and a history of stepping into voids with solutions, and that meant that when her opinions landed on the farm's future, they carried a different weight than mine. It felt like watching someone call an old number and expecting a particular voice. The voice returned, and suddenly the old map was relevant again. My neighbor's posture shifted in the presence of this visitor, not because I had asked her to be different, but because she had a choice now to lean into a pattern that had kept her safe or to step into the unknown with me. I realized in that heartbeat that the blackout that had lit our first night had not been the only thing shaping us. There were other lights, other hands, histories that could appear with suitcases and good intentions and quietly tilt our precarious construction. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. Conflict, as it does, unspooled from that entrance in threads. I was not opposed to help. I was opposed to the way help came with a script that presumed my neighbor's choices would align with someone else's map. I watched our footing wobble. Decisions that had been private became group projects. Questions I had thought were simple between two people were reframed in the language of business and legacy. There were nights when I would look at her and see the old reflexes engaged, an apologetic nod where she had once flared, a seemingly minor consultation text sent across nights that tasted like a betrayal. She explained in fragments as well as she could. This woman had been there through earlier storms. Money had been provided, and then the politics of gratitude and obligation had woven themselves into a net. Her voice, when she explained, felt raw, like a half-sewn seam, and I felt the pull of wanting to be someone who supported and wanting to be someone who was not second to a ledger. The tension grew close. I found myself counting the messages that landed on her phone, how often she would step away during our evenings to answer a question about grazing schedules, and resentments accumulated like damp. I tried to be careful not to make demands disguised as planful love, but the space between us tightened into a kind of pressure I had not anticipated. There were moments of sorrow, her apologetic eyes when she realized she had deferred to the other woman's counsel in my presence. My own stilted attempts to appear composed while something hot and animal in me wanted simply to take my neighbor's face in my hands and say, "Choose, choose, choose." There were also moments where I understood, fully and painfully, why she had both the habit and the need to consult. The other woman had been a lifeline when the farm's debts were severe and the weather worse. Her investments had come with no small share of strings, and gratitude had taxonomies I did not fully comprehend. Still, gratitude did not excuse the way it could become a slow undermining. The choice she faced was not a simple one of loyalties. It was tangled with history, with fear, and with the practicalities of land under pressure. Emotional escalation. The distance between us widened then, not in an immediate rupture, but like a road left untraveled. We kept trying to walk it, but the pavement crumbled underfoot. There were nights of quiet withdrawal, the kind that is more dangerous than explosive confrontation because it leaves room for your mind to assemble worst-case scenarios. I went to the dance studio to clear the fog in my head, to feel the steady count of music and the reassurance of moving as a rehearsed pattern. Movement calmed me, but it could not erase the image of her speaking on the phone in low measured tones while I cooked in the other room. The kitchen felt like a stage where different scripts were being read at once. We both tried to hold onto the things that had first made us brave: candlelit honesty, the small renovations of the farmhouse kitchen, the plans for a stable that held our combined initials in a carved plank. Yet small habits betrayed us. I would find a message thread and read it with a hunger I hated. She would find me paging through brochures for grants I had hoped we might apply to together and decide, without telling me, to take a meeting with the woman who had been the source of help for years. At a meeting that felt like it had come from an earlier century, the other woman, call her the benefactor, sat with a calmness that was the product of experience. She had suggestions, handouts, and a tone that proposed safety again, as if a different kind of darkness could be friendlier if purchased. There were moments where I felt like an interloper in my own story, watching someone I loved consider handing part of her life away in exchange for a different kind of certainty. I could not help wanting certainty too, but my brand of certainty was not purchased, it was grown. That difference became a chasm. We argued in small ways and large. The arguments were not theatrical. They were quiet, bitterly practical conversations about deadlines, about the way decisions were framed, about whether acceptance of certain help meant we were selling not merely the land, but something of ourselves. I heard myself become someone suspicious of motives and protective of a fragile authenticity that had been built on our nights of candlelight. She, in turn, accused me of being theatrical and demanding, of asking her to discard the history that had kept her afloat. The words stung because they were true in different ways. Each of us held our truth as if it were an iron bar we could not let go of. The strain made tenderness rarer for a while, but also more intense when it appeared. We started leaving small notes for each other, a post-it with a list of things to buy, a card tucked under a plate with a line about being proud. The notes read like micro-commitments, small contracts of affection. When we did touch now, it was wary and then hungry, as if the fear of being denied each other had made contact a scarce currency. There were hands under the table during a grant-writing marathon, fingers finding familiar knuckles and squeezing for courage. There were nights when she would brush hair back from my forehead and whisper the hurried comfort of someone who had almost lost herself in other people's needs. Those whispered comforts were not theatrical or coercive. They were stitches that intended to mend. The first great fracture came when a call for a public hearing about zoning and potential sale collided with a decision she had already made after a private meeting. The write-up was dry and full of statistics. The human toll was not. I felt the coldness of being bypassed, as if in my lapses I had become someone who allowed other people's involvement to trump our joint planning. I could not be simply angry. Anger required a surface. My anger was more like a tidal reasoning that battered our shared logic until trust eroded. It was then I confronted my own capacity for loss, whether I could love someone who might choose safety over us. I realized in a shock of brutal honesty that love is not just choosing in perfect weather. Often it is choosing when storm clouds gather and the cost is counted in old patterns. Climax and crisis. The crisis arrived with the bluntness of a winter hailstorm. There was a hearing where voices rose and opinions were measured, where she had to present her case to a room that cared more for profit lines than for the sentimental lineage of families who had kept land. She spoke with the courage born of years of knowing the earth and the horses and how to read a weather map. Her voice did not tremble. The tremor was in the air that followed. Afterwards, standing on the porch as the auditorium emptied, she told me that the benefactor had made an offer directly to buy the easement and protect the farm from industrial development, but that there were strings attached, certain operational control, annual oversight, and a slow subtraction of a family's autonomy. Choosing that offer would secure immediate future, but would place the farm's fate subtly out of her hands. I felt the world tilt. In me there was a categorical refusal of any bargain that demanded we trade identity for protection. She felt the opposite, a burning tiredness at the prospect of another season of legal wrangling with corporations that spoke in numbers. The conversation that followed was neither graceful nor simple. She showed me her hands with the neatness of someone who loved, but also had to account for realities. I showed her the letters, my own little arsenal of research, my willingness to put my voice on stage. We were two people trying to be allied, but with different strategies for survival. She proposed accepting the offer and using the short-term security to build something more long-lasting out of a place that would then be protected from development. I proposed a fight that would drain resources, but might preserve the farm's autonomy in the longer arc. We stood on opposite shores. I remember the precise way night pressed on the porch that evening, the condensation forming on the rail, the silhouette of a mare in a distant paddock. Our breathing matched and did not. My hand went to her face and then to the small scar on her knuckle as if to anchor myself to the person beneath the decisions. She squeezed my shoulder as if to say I am not a stranger in my own skin, and I pressed my forehead against hers like a child wanting assurance. It was not a kiss that solved anything. It was a kiss that admitted the truth, that love alone did not dissolve life's complexities. We lay on the floor of her kitchen afterward and spoke slowly, the words heavy and true. We loved each other enough to cause pain and to bear it. The crisis was the collision of our histories, and our reconciliation would have to be the hard work of aligning two maps into a single route. Don't forget, every week we share new tales. Subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you are always the first to hear them. There were days when the fight left us raw. There were nights when we lay facing each other, hands tangled, whispering the lists of what we feared and what we would refuse to lose. We held each other in the hospital of emotions, applying the bandages of patience. We learned to consult one another before answering the benefactor's emails. She learned to tell me when she needed to hear my voice before she signed. I learned to listen when she said she needed quiet to weigh options. We discovered that agreement is less dramatic than alignment, and alignment is the slow tending of the ground beneath both of our feet. There were triumphs amid the rubble. We found a local coalition of farmers who had fought similar buyouts, and we were not alone. Their knowledge became practical armor. We cobbled together grants and community donations. My words turned into petitions and letters, and a small crowdfunding effort that made headlines in our local paper. The benefactor withdrew her conditional offer in favor of a plan that respected the farm's legacy. We celebrated in small ways. She cooked pasta, and we danced in the kitchen, barefoot and unpracticed, our bodies a language of forgiveness and joy. We kissed in the doorway, the kind of kiss that blooms from relief and exhilaration, lips pressing hard enough to prove that the night could be ours again. At the emotional peak, when the future finally felt like a terrain we could share rather than a cliff to be navigated alone, we found a new rhythm. We learned to sleep near each other without the fear that either of us would be called away by outside forces. We became, to our own surprise, indispensable. There were more than 3 kisses from then on, each one a marker on a timeline that traced our survival. A kiss in the rain after a long day of negotiations. A kiss in a quiet gallery where she insisted we see a painting that reminded her of sunrise on the farm. Another in the middle of a midnight therapy session where we forgave ourselves the long list of tiny betrayals. The physical closeness evolved. We held hands under tables at community meetings, brushed hair out of each other's faces, leaned in to whisper reassurance when public opinions felt crushing. Our bodies synchronized in small domestic acts, cooking, the careful threading of a needle, the way we would fall asleep in the same curled puzzle each night. Just a quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button and stay with us here on Sapphic Tales. Resolution and closing reflection. What lasted was not perfection, but the decision to continue. We discovered that love's endurance is not a miraculous spell, but a series of intentional choices, showing up, resourcing, telling hard truths, and listening when it was easiest to walk away. She learned to weigh gratitude without yielding her voice. I learned to stop imagining she was choosing other people over me and instead believed that her decisions were not about exclusion, but about legacy. We rewired old reflexes with new habits, a call before a meeting, open calendars, and the slow inclusion of me in conversations that had once been private in ways that made me an outsider. The farm never became something else entirely. It remained a messy collage of barns and hay, of morning light that hit the pastures in a way that made me think of the first candle we had shared. The horses were still unruly and exquisite. The mare's stubbornness had not abated, but neither had her capacity for grace. Our home life knit itself into the patterns of chores and laughter, of arguments and apologies. We learned a new intimacy in the small tasks, showing up to clip a dog's nails even when neither of us wanted to, reading each other's grant drafts with less critique and more partnership, waking early to watch foals wobble on new legs. There were celebrations in our life that did not require thunder. The screenplay I had been working on, once a small, stubborn seed, found air and light and a path. It was never the blockbuster I had feared, but it found a gentle audience, enough to validate the work and to fund further writing. She stood in the crowd at the read-through, and I felt, in that moment, the small, raw pride that comes from being seen by someone who had watched you rebuild. She smiled at me with the kind of soft affection that knew the long night of the blackout and everything after. The farm's survivals were not solitary. They had our names attached, in pen strokes and in the way we archived receipts and drafted letters together. In the quiet evenings, when we would sit on the porch and the horizon softened into lavender, I thought often about that first candle. The blackout had been a crude instrument of fate, an abrupt, inconvenient darkness that exposed us by stripping away the things that disguised us from one another. It had not performed the miracle of love on its own. It had only provided a stage. What made the love endure was what we did after the blackout, how we chose to listen, to risk, to walk toward complexity together rather than letting historic patterns decide our paths. In choosing each other, we had to be brave in small, human ways, by asking for space when needed, by staying when it was hard, by learning to hold the other's professional and personal griefs without being consumed. We fell asleep often with our foreheads touching, the ordinary punctuation of shared life. We whispered our small promises without ceremony and meant them. We learned the bedside conversation as a practice of tender disclosures, fears, hopes, small logistical requests. We kissed in the dark and in the light, in kitchens crowded with paperwork and on the floor where a foal had been born earlier that season. Our love was not the end of storms, but the shelter we made together. If it kept you hooked, subscribe now to Sapphic Tales so you never miss the next. Now when I watch a power cut across the city, an intermittent flicker that makes people grope for cords, I feel a little thrill. Not the panic I used to, but the recognition that sometimes, in the blink of an absent light, life rearranges itself to allow for surprise. I think of that first candle and of a neighbor I had once dismissed to the geography of polite acquaintance. I remember the panicked knock, the flashlights, the camping stove like a small ritual of readiness, the broken popcorn and our clumsy laughter. Most of all, I remember how we chose to stay after the power came back on, how we learned to be each other's steady current when outside forces threatened to short the connection. Our life is not the story of a miraculous bolt of lightning that zapped two people in love. It is the slow, stubborn chronicle of two women who met because the grid failed, then decided to keep choosing one another when the lights returned. We built ordinary rituals and defended the extraordinary work of keeping land and love intact. The blackout that lit up my life was only the beginning. Everything after was the painstaking, beautiful labor of two people learning to be enough for each other.